A racist neighbor called the police to the wedding, and officers responded with brutality and arrests. But when the bride and groom's identities are revealed, their actions have unexpected consequences. Will the newlyweds be able to get justice? Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching this from. The sun was setting over the neatly trimmed hedges of the upscale neighborhood, casting a warm, golden light across the backyard of a large, elegant house. The air was filled with the cheerful murmur of guests mingling and celebrating under strings of twinkling lights. A soft breeze carried the sweet scent of flowers from the carefully arranged centerpieces, adding a touch of nature's beauty to the joyous event. It was a perfect evening for a wedding, and the smiles on the faces of everyone present spoke of the love and hope shared by the newlyweds. Standing amidst their friends and family, Abigail and Marcus were the picture of happiness. Abigail, a respected judge known for her integrity and unwavering commitment to justice, looked radiant in her white dress, her smile shining as brightly as the setting sun. Marcus, her husband, a high-ranking FBI agent, stood tall beside her, his arm around her shoulders, a look of deep admiration in his eyes. Their love was evident in every shared glance, every quiet word exchanged between them, and their guests were equally thrilled to be part of their special day. The couple had chosen to host their wedding at their home, a place that symbolized their shared dreams and the life they had built together. Marcus had worked tirelessly to create a backyard that felt both intimate and open, a place where their closest friends and family could gather in celebration. Abigail's parents, proud of their daughter's achievements, mingled with guests sharing stories of her youth and offering heartfelt congratulations. Marcus's family, many of whom had traveled from across the country, laughed and toasted to the newlyweds' future, their voices blending with the soft music playing in the background. Unbeknownst to them, just a few houses down the street, an old woman sat in her living room, peering through her lace curtains. Mrs. Rose, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, had always been known for her sharp tongue and her tendency to meddle in the affairs of others. Today, her eyes narrowed as she watched the gathering in Marcus and Abigail's backyard, a deep frown etching lines across her face. She had seen many things in her years living here, but a celebration like this, filled with people she considered out of place, stirred a familiar anger within her. Mrs. Rose reached for her phone, her bony fingers gripping it tightly as she dialed a number she knew all too well. She called the police, her voice sharp and accusing as she spun a story of loud noise and suspicious activity coming from the house down the street. She hinted at potential criminal behavior, her words laced with thinly veiled prejudice. By the time she hung up, she had painted a picture that was far from the reality of the joyful gathering. At the precinct, the dispatcher took the call, and a few officers on duty exchanged glances. It was a quiet evening, and the chance to respond to a call about a potential disturbance in an affluent neighborhood piqued their interest. Without much hesitation, a team of officers was dispatched to investigate the scene, their expressions hardening with anticipation as they headed toward the address. Meanwhile, back at the house, the mood remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. Abigail was deep in conversation with her childhood friend, sharing stories and laughter, while Marcus spoke with his uncle about an upcoming family reunion. The children ran around the yard, their laughter blending with the clinking of glasses as toasts were made. The guests chatted, unaware of the tension building just outside the perimeter of their celebration. As the sky deepened into shades of pink and purple, Abigail and Marcus shared a dance, their movements graceful and full of joy. Friends and family gathered around, clapping along to the rhythm, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the lights. It was a moment they would remember forever, a brief, perfect snapshot of love and unity, untouched by the world outside. But beyond the hedge that bordered their property, headlights pierced the dusk. The rumble of police cars rolling to a stop broke through the harmony of the evening, though no one in the yard noticed at first. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, adjusting their belts and exchanging brief words as they prepared to approach. Their eyes scanned the scene, but their expressions showed no sign of recognizing the happy occasion that was unfolding before them. The first sign of trouble came when one of the younger guests noticed the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the house. A murmur spread through the crowd as more people turned to see the line of police cars parked outside. Marcus noticed the shift in the atmosphere and gently guided Abigail toward the source of the disturbance, his expression shifting from joy to concern. "What's going on?" Abigail asked, her brow furrowed as she glanced toward the officers. Marcus squeezed her hand reassuringly, though a knot of worry was forming in his own chest. He could see the determination in the officers' faces as they approached, their hands resting on their holsters. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward and called out, his voice cutting through the night air. "We've received reports of a disturbance here. Everyone needs to remain where they are." Marcus and Abigail exchanged a quick glance, silently agreeing to remain calm. Abigail, ever the professional, stepped forward to address the officers. "Good evening, officers. This is a private event. Our wedding, actually. Is there a misunderstanding?" The officer's gaze swept over the gathering, and he frowned. "We've received reports of suspicious activity and potential noise violations. We're going to need to investigate." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He knew that tone of voice, the one that dismissed any explanation before it was even given. But he kept his voice steady as he spoke. "Officer, we assure you this is simply a wedding celebration. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have, but there's no reason for concern here." The officer's expression didn't soften. Instead, he gestured to his fellow officers, who began to spread out, moving through the crowd with an air of authority. The guests, who had initially thought this might be a simple misunderstanding, began to grow uneasy as the officers questioned them, their demeanor far from friendly. Abigail's parents watched with growing worry, their faces pale under the lights. Marcus's brother, a lawyer, tried to step in to offer legal counsel, but he was brushed off by the officers, who seemed uninterested in listening to explanations. The joyful atmosphere of the evening was rapidly dissolving into confusion and fear. Abigail felt a knot of frustration growing in her chest, but she took a deep breath, reminding herself to remain calm. She knew that if they were going to de-escalate the situation, they needed to keep their heads cool. Marcus stood beside her, his hand still on her shoulder, providing a steady presence amidst the rising tension. Yet, despite their best efforts, they could feel the shift, the unspoken prejudice in the way the officers looked at them, the dismissive tone in their voices. As Abigail glanced at Marcus, she could see the same realization in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. It was the beginning of something much more troubling. The chapter ends with Abigail and Marcus standing together, facing the officers who are determined to find fault where none exists, unaware that this confrontation will soon spiral out of control, threatening to overshadow what should have been the happiest day of their lives. As the officers continued to move through the gathering, the festive atmosphere dissolved entirely, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to settle over the backyard like a fog. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the faces of guests who exchanged nervous glances and murmured among themselves. For a moment, it was as if time had frozen. An event meant to celebrate love and unity was now being overshadowed by suspicion and doubt. Abigail and Marcus stood side by side, watching as the officers spoke to their friends and family with an air of impatience and condescension. The tone was unmistakable. Questions were not polite inquiries, but thinly veiled accusations. Abigail could feel her pulse quickening with every dismissive glance, every terse response that the officers gave to their guests. "Excuse me, officer," she called out, her voice calm but firm as she approached the lead officer who had first spoken. "I understand that you're responding to a report, but I can assure you that there is no criminal activity here. This is a private event. We have all the necessary permits, and we're not in violation of any ordinances." The officer turned to face her, his gaze sweeping over her with a mixture of skepticism and annoyance. "We'll be the judge of that, ma'am," he said, his tone dismissive. He took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt as if to make a point. "We need to conduct our investigation, so I suggest you cooperate." Marcus stepped forward, his expression controlled but firm. "Officer, my wife is a judge," he stated, his voice even but unmistakably serious. "We're more than familiar with the law, and we know our rights. There's no need for this level of scrutiny." The officer's eyes flicked toward Marcus, and a faint, disdainful smile touched his lips. "A judge, huh?" he muttered, as if the words were of little consequence. "Well, that doesn't change the fact that we've received reports of possible illegal activities on this property. We need to verify what's going on." Nearby, Marcus's brother, who had overheard the exchange, stepped forward as well. "I'm a lawyer," he interjected. "I can confirm that everything here is in order. If you need any documents or permits, we'd be happy to provide them." But instead of acknowledging the offer, the officer simply waved a hand dismissively. "Step back," he barked. "We don't need any help from you." It was a clear message. The officers had no interest in being reasonable or cooperative. They were here to assert their authority, and the legal knowledge of the guests, no matter how extensive, was not going to deter them from doing so. The officers began to question the guests more aggressively, their words laced with insinuations. When one elderly guest attempted to explain that this was a wedding celebration and not some sort of suspicious gathering, the officer responded with a curt, "We'll see about that." Abigail's father, noticing the rising tension, tried to step in. "Please, officers, there's no need for this," he said, his voice steady but concerned. "We're law-abiding citizens. There's nothing here that warrants—" "Sir, step back," the lead officer snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We'll decide what warrants our attention." It was then that Marcus noticed one of the officers patting down a young teenage guest who had come with his family. The boy, clearly frightened, kept his hands raised as the officer searched him. "Is this really necessary?" Marcus called out, his voice rising slightly. "That's a child. He's done nothing wrong." But the officer ignored him, continuing his search with a roughness that caused the boy to wince. Abigail's frustration grew as she saw the way the officers seemed to target the youngest and oldest among them, as if to intimidate and disempower the group as a whole. "Officer," she said, her tone now sharper as she approached the lead officer again, "you're overstepping your bounds. You have no grounds to be searching our guests like this." The lead officer turned to face her once more, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere with our investigation, we'll have to take action against you." The words hung in the air like a threat, and for a moment the guests seemed to hold their breath. Marcus instinctively placed a hand on Abigail's arm, not to restrain her, but to remind her that they needed to remain composed, no matter how outrageous the behavior of the officers became. Abigail took a step back, her jaw set in a determined line. "I'm not interfering," she said, her voice steady. "I'm exercising my rights, and the rights of everyone here, to be treated with respect and fairness." The lead officer's gaze darkened. "I suggest you start cooperating, ma'am," he said, "or you'll find yourself in the back of a squad car." The aggressive tone did not go unnoticed by the guests, some of whom began to speak up in defense of Abigail and Marcus. "You can't do this," one man said, his voice raised in protest. "They haven't done anything wrong." Another woman added, "This is harassment. There's no reason for any of this." But the more the guests protested, the more the officers seemed to dig in their heels, their actions becoming increasingly hostile. Two officers began to separate the guests into smaller groups, while others started to ask for identification, as if the backyard of a wedding had suddenly turned into a crime scene. As Marcus watched the scene unfold, a sinking feeling grew in the pit of his stomach. He had faced many difficult situations in his career, but never had he felt so helpless in the face of such blatant disregard for the law. It wasn't just a matter of authority being misused. It was the fact that the officers' actions were fueled by an unspoken prejudice, one that saw the color of their skin as a justification for suspicion. Abigail's mother, visibly shaken, reached out to her daughter. "Abigail, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Abigail squeezed her mother's hand reassuringly, though her own heart was pounding with a mix of anger and fear. "We're not going to let them intimidate us," she replied, her voice calm despite the turmoil inside. "We have the law on our side." Yet, even as she spoke, she could see the smirks on some of the officers' faces, as if they were enjoying the display of power. One officer began to walk toward the house, as if intending to search the premises without any consent. Abigail moved to intercept him. "You need a warrant to enter the house," she said sharply. "You don't have one, so stay where you are." The officer glanced back at her with a look of contempt. "Lady, don't tell me how to do my job." As he continued toward the house, Marcus stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You heard my wife," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You don't have the authority to enter our home." The officer's hand twitched toward his holster, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Step aside," he ordered. Marcus did not move. He stood his ground, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "Not until you respect our rights," he said. At that moment, it became painfully clear to everyone present that this was not just about a noise complaint or a misunderstanding. The officer's behavior had crossed a line, and the situation was spiraling toward something far more serious than anyone could have anticipated. The next steps would determine whether it ended with words or with violence. The chapter closes with Abigail and Marcus standing firm, refusing to back down even as the officers press forward, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test their resolve and challenge the very justice that Abigail had dedicated her life to upholding. The evening sky, once painted in vibrant hues of twilight, had now settled into a deep and unsettling darkness, illuminated only by the flashing red and blue lights of the police vehicles parked in front of the house. The mood in the backyard had shifted from anxious murmurs to palpable fear, and it was evident that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The officers, now numbering more than a dozen, began to tighten their grip on the gathering. Their demeanor had grown increasingly hostile, and their actions were no longer merely about investigating a supposed disturbance. They were about exerting dominance. The guests, who had initially tried to reason with the officers, were now met with harsh commands and rough handling, as if the backyard had suddenly become a battlefield. Abigail and Marcus stood at the center of the chaos, trying to hold their ground as the officers' aggression intensified. Abigail's role as a judge had done nothing to deter the officers. If anything, it seemed to provoke them further. When she reminded them of her position and the legal limitations on their actions, she was met with scornful glares and mocking laughter. "Judge or not, you're in no position to give orders," one officer sneered as he pushed past her. The dismissiveness in his voice cut like a knife, but Abigail refused to be silenced. She wasn't going to allow the situation to devolve without a fight. Near the edge of the backyard, a small group of guests had been forced to kneel on the ground, their hands behind their heads. Several elderly relatives, visibly distraught, were being roughly directed by officers who showed little concern for their age or condition. It was as if any semblance of respect or decency had been discarded the moment the first badge was flashed. Marcus, watching as his relatives were treated like criminals, felt his blood boil. His training as a high-ranking FBI agent had taught him how to remain calm in tense situations, but this was different. This wasn't an operation against dangerous suspects. This was an attack on his family, and it was being carried out under the guise of law enforcement. He clenched his fist, fighting the urge to intervene physically, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the violence. Abigail's voice rang out across the backyard as she continued to challenge the officers' actions. "This is illegal. You can't detain us without cause." Her words were clear and authoritative, a voice of reason amidst the chaos, but her defiance only seemed to fuel the officers' hostility. "Keep talking, and we'll make sure you're the first to go," an officer shot back, his hand moving dangerously close to the baton strapped to his belt. It was then that Marcus noticed one of the officers aggressively patting down a teenage boy, one of the younger guests. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 14, was trembling as the officer roughly searched him. His hands were shaking in the air and he struggled to hold back tears. "Get your hands off him," Marcus shouted, unable to contain his outrage. He moved toward the officer, his movements swift but controlled. "He's a kid. There's no reason for this." The officer looked up, his expression hardening. "Back off," he warned, his voice dripping with menace, "or you'll find yourself on the ground next." Ignoring the threat, Marcus stepped closer, his presence looming over the officer. "Enough," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're out of line." The tension between Marcus and the officer reached a breaking point, and it was clear that a confrontation was imminent. But before either could make another move, Abigail placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, pulling him back. "Not like this," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't give them an excuse." The officer smirked, as if satisfied by the sight of Marcus retreating. He gave the boy one last shove before stepping away, leaving the teenager shaken but unharmed. The incident, however, had only served to heighten the fear and anger spreading through the crowd. The guests had witnessed enough to understand that the officers were not interested in resolving the situation peacefully. For some, the sight of their loved ones being treated like criminals was too much to bear, and a few began to speak out more forcefully, demanding answers, demanding justice. The officers, reacting to the growing resistance, began to move in with increased aggression. One officer drew his baton and approached an elderly woman who had been pleading for the release of her grandson. "Ma'am, step back," he barked, his tone devoid of empathy. When she hesitated, her frail hands reaching toward her grandson, the officer raised the baton threateningly. Marcus saw the motion and surged forward, catching the officer's wrist just before he could strike. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The officer's eyes widened with fury, and in the next moment, he was shouting for backup. "He assaulted me," the officer yelled, his voice carrying through the yard. "Get him down." Several officers rushed in, shoving Marcus back. The scene exploded into chaos as the guests tried to intervene, some shouting at the officers to stop, while others struggled to protect their loved ones. The police response was swift and brutal. They grabbed Marcus, forcing him to the ground as Abigail cried out in horror. Her husband, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, was being treated as though he were a violent criminal. Abigail tried to push her way through to Marcus, but she was intercepted by two officers who blocked her path, their faces cold and unyielding. "You're obstructing justice," one of them said. "Step aside." "Justice?" Abigail shot back, her voice rising with anger. "This isn't justice. This is a violation of our rights." She could feel the heat of tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. This was far from over. One officer reached for her arm, but she twisted out of his grasp, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare touch me," she warned, and for a moment the officer hesitated, taken aback by the intensity in her eyes. But the moment of hesitation was brief. The officers closed in on her, one of them grabbing her wrist and twisting it behind her back as another pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest," he said, the words echoing with finality. As Abigail was restrained, she glanced over at Marcus, who was still struggling against the officers holding him down. The sight of her husband, the man who had always stood as a protector, now being treated so unjustly, tore at her heart. She bit back a sob, determined not to let them see her break. The officers began arresting other guests as well, not sparing anyone who dared to voice their discontent. Even the children were pulled aside and threatened with detention if they didn't comply. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, as if the air itself had thickened with dread, suffocating any hope of a peaceful resolution. Marcus, pinned beneath two officers, managed to lift his head and meet Abigail's gaze. "Stay strong," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We'll get through this." His words gave her a flicker of strength, and she nodded, trying to convey through her expression that she would not give up. Not now, not ever. But as the night wore on and the sounds of struggle echoed across the yard, it was clear that they were facing a force that would not easily relent. The chapter closes with the once celebratory scene now reduced to chaos and fear, the bride and groom torn apart and treated like common criminals. Abigail and Marcus are forced to confront not only the physical aggression of the officers, but also the deeper, more insidious battle against a system that saw their rights as expendable. The night had descended fully, and the once beautiful backyard now felt more like a war zone than a place of celebration. The flickering lights from the police cars cast long, ominous shadows across the lawn, and the air was thick with the echoes of shouting voices, both of anger and of despair. For every command barked by an officer, there was a desperate plea from a guest or a firm declaration of rights. Yet, the more people tried to reason with the police, the more aggressive the officers became. Abigail, her wrists still cuffed behind her back, struggled to remain calm despite the throbbing pain in her arm. The officer who had restrained her had been unnecessarily rough, twisting her wrist to an agonizing angle before forcing her hands into the cuffs. She was no stranger to the law, but experiencing such blatant disregard for justice firsthand was an entirely different matter. Nearby, Marcus was pinned to the ground by two officers. His suit was rumpled and dirty from the struggle, but his voice remained steady. "You have no grounds to arrest us," he said, his words strained but clear. "We're not resisting, and we have committed no crimes. Release us immediately." One of the officers pressing him down glanced up with a sneer. "You people never think you're in the wrong, do you?" His words dripped with contempt, and the underlying meaning was unmistakable. Before Marcus could respond, there was a commotion from behind. Several guests had gathered together, their voices rising in a chorus of protest. "Let them go," they shouted. "This is wrong." Abigail seized the moment. She turned her attention to the lead officer, whose gaze swept over the crowd with an air of growing irritation. "Officer," she called out, her voice carrying over the noise, "I demand to speak as a judge about the legality of your actions. You are violating not just our rights, but the law itself. You're conducting these searches and arrests without any reasonable cause or warrant." The lead officer's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to her. His eyes were cold as he spoke. "Ma'am, this is a police investigation. You don't get to dictate how we handle it." He took a moment to glance at his fellow officers before adding, "And just because you're a judge doesn't mean the rules bend for you." Abigail's heart pounded with frustration, but she drew herself up as best she could despite her restrained hands. "I'm not asking you to bend the rules," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm demanding that you follow them. You have no right to detain us, search us, or enter our home without a warrant." The officer's response was immediate and brutal. "Get her out of here," he snapped. "If she wants to make speeches, she can do it from a cell." Two officers grabbed her by the arms and began to drag her toward one of the squad cars. The roughness of their grip caused her to stumble, but she caught herself, her jaw clenched against the pain. As she was being hauled away, Abigail's voice rang out once more. "You're only proving our point. This isn't law enforcement, it's abuse of power." Meanwhile, Marcus watched with mounting horror as his wife was dragged toward the police cars. He struggled against the officers, pinning him down, his anger giving him a surge of strength. "Get your hands off her!" he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. The officers responded by pressing him even harder against the ground. "You're not in control here," one of them hissed, tightening his grip. "So, stay down." Seeing his wife being treated so violently pushed Marcus to the edge. He could no longer keep his composure as an agent who had sworn to uphold the law. Now, he was simply a man fighting to protect his wife. With a burst of effort, he pushed himself up from the ground, just enough to shake off one of the officer's grips. The movement was enough to allow him to scramble to his knees. The officer who had been holding him down stumbled back and quickly recovered, drawing his baton and raising it menacingly. "I said, stay down," he barked, advancing toward Marcus. It was in that moment, as the officer's baton swung downward, that Marcus reached up and blocked the strike with his forearm. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his arm, but he held his ground. "Enough of this," he said, his voice low and filled with controlled fury. "We have the right to defend ourselves." Other officers, seeing Marcus rise, began to converge on him, their faces twisted in determination to subdue him once more. Abigail, witnessing this from the edge of the yard, felt a surge of anger and fear that overpowered her pain. She couldn't stand by and watch Marcus be hurt. She refused to be helpless in this fight. Drawing on every ounce of her training and resolve, Abigail shouted over the chaos, "Stop this now! You're violating the civil rights of everyone here! This will not go unanswered!" Her declaration seemed to cut through the din of the night, causing a momentary hesitation in the officers. For an instant, there was silence, as if the weight of her words had momentarily stunned everyone. But then, just as quickly, the lead officer regained his composure and barked orders to his men. "Take them all in," he shouted. "Charge them with obstruction and whatever else we can find. If they want to fight, we'll give them a reason to remember tonight." The words were a call to arms for the officers, who redoubled their efforts. Several more guests were seized, their cries of protest drowned out by the officers' commands. Even the children were not spared from the chaos, as some were forcibly separated from their parents and led to the side. Marcus and Abigail were both overwhelmed and pinned down once more. Their attempts to defend themselves met with increasing force. In the struggle, Abigail caught a glimpse of one of her elderly relatives being shoved roughly toward a squad car and another child being pulled away from his mother, tears streaming down his face. The sight ignited a deep-seated rage within her. "You think you can treat us like this without consequences?" she spat, her voice carrying a mixture of pain and fury. "We will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated." Her defiance only seemed to provoke the officers further, and one of them, in an attempt to silence her, roughly pushed her to the ground. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through her shoulder, but she refused to let them see her weakened. She struggled to her feet again, using every ounce of strength to rise. The situation had deteriorated to a level beyond anyone's control. What had started as a joyous celebration had turned into a harrowing ordeal marked by brutality and injustice. Abigail and Marcus, once hopeful and joyous, now found themselves standing against a system determined to break them. The fight was no longer just about their own freedom. It was about exposing the abuse of power and standing up for everyone who had been wronged that night. The chapter closes with Abigail and Marcus standing amidst the chaos, bloodied but unbowed, their eyes filled with a defiance that refused to be extinguished. The battle was far from over, but as they faced the cold stares of the officers, they knew one thing for certain: they would not give up, no matter the cost. The air crackled with tension as Abigail and Marcus stood defiantly amidst the chaos. They were bruised and restrained, but their spirits remained unbroken. The flashing lights from the squad cars illuminated their determined expressions, and the night echoed with cries of outrage and despair from the guests who were witnessing a celebration transform into a nightmare. The officers had seized control of the scene, or so it seemed, but what they did not realize was that the tide was about to turn. As Marcus struggled to regain his breath from the rough handling, he met Abigail's gaze. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They had been pushed to their limits, and now it was time to reveal who they truly were, not just as victims of this abuse of power, but as individuals who wielded significant authority in their own right. It was time to confront the officers with a reality they could not ignore. Abigail, her voice ragged from shouting, straightened herself as best she could despite the pain. "You think you can do this without consequences?" she called out, her words piercing through the commotion. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The lead officer, who had ordered the aggressive actions, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of irritation and smugness. "Lady, I don't care who you think you are," he sneered. "You're under arrest just like the rest of them." Abigail's eyes flashed with a fierce resolve. "I'm Judge Abigail Turner," she declared, her voice cutting through the air with unmistakable authority. "I have served on the bench for over 10 years, and I know the law better than anyone here. What you're doing is not only illegal, it's a gross violation of our civil rights." The revelation seemed to hit the lead officer like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, his smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced at the other officers, some of whom exchanged nervous glances, as if beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. But Abigail was not finished. She turned to Marcus, who had managed to stand upright despite the officers still surrounding him. "And this is my husband, Marcus Turner," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "He's not just an ordinary citizen, he's a high-ranking agent with the FBI." The weight of her words seemed to drop like a stone, creating a ripple of shock that passed through the crowd. Even the guests who had known the couple for years had not anticipated the impact that this revelation would have. The officers, however, were visibly rattled. They exchanged looks of disbelief and discomfort, clearly struggling to process what they had just learned. The lead officer's face darkened with anger. "You think your titles make you untouchable?" he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "It doesn't change anything. You're still interfering with an investigation." "Interfering?" Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried a dangerous edge. "You call this an investigation? You arrived here without a warrant, harassed our guests, and used excessive force against unarmed civilians, including children and the elderly. Do you really think that won't come back to haunt you?" His words were like a cold wind cutting through the heat of the confrontation. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, some of them casting glances toward the squad cars where several guests were still being detained. It was clear that their confidence had begun to waver. Abigail seized the moment to press further. "Everything you've done here has been recorded," she said, gesturing toward the crowd where several guests had captured the entire incident on their phones. "And those recordings are already being sent to the media and our legal team. This situation is no longer in your control." The lead officer's face flushed red with rage, and he took a step closer to Abigail, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "You may be a judge and he may be an agent, but out here, that doesn't mean a damn thing." Abigail held his gaze without flinching. "We'll see about that," she replied coolly. "Your actions tonight will be reviewed by more than just this department. There will be an investigation, and I guarantee you heads will roll." As if on cue, several of the guests who had been recording the incident began to speak up, loudly voicing their support for Abigail and Marcus. "She's right," one man shouted. "You can't treat people like this just because you have a badge." "Let them go," another woman yelled. "They haven't done anything wrong." The outcry seemed to shake the last remnants of the officers' control over the situation. Some of the younger officers, clearly unnerved, began to step back, while others exchanged tense whispers, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of mounting public scrutiny. Seeing the shift, Marcus decided to take the next step. He turned to address the officers directly. "If you want to salvage what's left of your careers, you'll release everyone now and walk away. Otherwise, I promise you, every one of you will be named in the lawsuits that are coming." The threat hung heavily in the air, and for the first time that night, a sense of uncertainty crept into the expressions of even the most defiant officers. It was as if they were beginning to grasp the reality that this was not just an isolated incident, it was an explosive scandal waiting to happen. One of the older officers, a man with graying hair and a weary look in his eyes, stepped forward. "This has gone far enough," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of regret. "We need to de-escalate." The lead officer rounded on him, his expression one of incredulous anger. "De-escalate? They've been resisting this whole time." But the older officer shook his head. "No," he replied, his tone firm. "They've been asserting their rights, and we've been ignoring them. We need to back down." The statement hung in the air like a sudden calm after a storm. It was a recognition of the truth that had been there all along, a truth that could no longer be ignored or denied. The other officers began to lower their weapons and ease their grips on the restrained guests. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift from one of impending violence to one of uneasy truce. Abigail and Marcus stood together, their hands still bound, but their resolve unbroken. They had revealed who they were, not just in terms of their titles and positions, but as individuals who refused to be silenced in the face of injustice. They had stood against the abuse of power and exposed the arrogance of those who thought they could act with impunity. The chapter closes with the officers beginning to release the guests, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavily in the air. Abigail and Marcus remained resolute, knowing that while this battle was nearing an end, the fight for justice was only just beginning. The consequences of this night would reach far beyond the backyard, reverberating through the legal system and the court of public opinion. The officers began to back away from the restrained guests, their faces a mixture of shame, anger, and fear. The older officer who had called for de-escalation gave a curt nod to his colleagues, signaling them to start removing the handcuffs from the guests, including Abigail and Marcus. The tension in the air started to ease, but the atmosphere remained thick with the weight of what had transpired. As Abigail rubbed her sore wrist, now free from the metal cuffs, she felt the rush of relief mixed with a steely resolve. The damage had been done, and no amount of releasing their guests would erase the trauma of the night. She exchanged a look with Marcus, who was also being freed. The same determination burned in his eyes. They both knew that justice needed to be served. The guests gathered around, checking on one another and offering comfort to the children who had been separated from their parents. The scene, though calmer than before, still carried the remnants of chaos and fear. Several guests continued to film, capturing every moment as a testament to the events of the night. Abigail stepped forward and addressed the officers, her voice carrying the weight of her authority. "We are not finished here," she said, the tone of a judge delivering a verdict. "Every one of you who participated in this unlawful conduct will face the consequences. There will be an investigation, and your badges will not protect you." The lead officer, who had been the face of the hostility throughout the night, tried to muster a final defense. "You people were resisting," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "We were just doing our job." "Your job?" Marcus cut in, his voice sharp and filled with contempt. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize innocent people at a private event. You acted on baseless accusations and allowed your prejudice to dictate your actions. That's not law enforcement. That's an abuse of power." As his words sank in, the officer's defiance wavered, his jaw tightening in frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another officer, the one who had first called for de-escalation, stepped forward. "It's over," the older officer said quietly. He cast a somber glance at Abigail and Marcus. "I'm sorry. This never should have happened." The apology hung in the air, sincere but insufficient to undo the harm. Abigail held his gaze for a moment, her expression unyielding. "You're right," she replied. "It shouldn't have, and now there will be consequences." Word of the incident had already begun to spread beyond the backyard. The recordings from the guests had gone viral, quickly gaining traction on social media and attracting the attention of news outlets. Within hours, the story would become a headline, stirring outrage across the country. The legal ramifications began almost immediately. Abigail and Marcus, with the support of their influential families, filed formal complaints against the officers involved. The footage of the incident, showing the blatant misuse of force and violation of civil rights, became key evidence in the mounting case against the police department. The community, galvanized by the events of the night, rallied around the couple, calling for justice and demanding accountability. Investigations were launched at both the local and federal levels. Marcus's connections within the FBI helped to ensure that the inquiry would not be swept under the rug. The actions of the officers were scrutinized, their records examined for previous incidents of misconduct. What began as a neighborhood disturbance call had now evolved into a full-blown scandal, one that reached far beyond the scope of a single police department. The lead officer, who had been the most aggressive during the confrontation, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. His previous record, which contained complaints of excessive force and racial bias, came to light, casting a dark shadow over his career. Several of the other officers involved were also suspended, as their actions were dissected under the lens of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the story of the Weddington nightmare resonated with people across the nation, sparking discussions about police reform and racial bias within law enforcement. Abigail and Marcus found themselves at the center of a growing movement, one that sought to challenge the systemic issues that had allowed such abuse of power to persist. In the weeks that followed, the legal process began to unfold. Abigail and Marcus, alongside their legal team, prepared to take the case to court. Their goal was not only to seek justice for the harm they and their guests had suffered, but to set a precedent that would deter future misconduct. They wanted to ensure that the officers and the system that had enabled their behavior were held accountable. The courtroom became a battleground for the truth. Witnesses from the wedding testified, recounting the terror they had experienced and the excessive force used by the police. The recordings from the night were played in court, showing the indiscriminate aggression toward unarmed civilians, including children and elderly individuals. The footage left little room for the defense to argue that the officers' actions had been justified. Abigail took the stand, not just as a victim, but as a legal expert. She spoke with the authority of her profession, detailing the numerous legal violations committed that night and the lasting impact it had on everyone present. Her testimony was powerful. A judge who had experienced the abuse of power firsthand, now using her voice to condemn it. Marcus, too, testified, drawing on his background as an FBI agent. He described the proper protocols that should have been followed and how the officers' actions had deviated from those standards in every possible way. His words carried the weight of someone who had dedicated his life to law enforcement and knew what it meant to uphold the law with integrity. The case garnered widespread attention, with civil rights organizations and community leaders showing their support for Abigail and Marcus. The trial became a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice, drawing people together in the call for meaningful reform. Ultimately, the jury found in favor of Abigail and Marcus. The court ruled that the officers had violated the couple's civil rights and had acted with excessive force and racial bias. The police department was ordered to pay significant damages, and several officers faced disciplinary actions, including termination and potential criminal charges. The lead officer, in particular, was charged with misconduct, marking the end of his law enforcement career. With the verdict delivered, Abigail and Marcus stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and media. The journey to this moment had been grueling, but they had emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted. They knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but this victory was a significant step in the right direction. Abigail addressed the crowd, her voice steady and resolute. "Tonight, we proved that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to enforce it. We will continue to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for every person who has been silenced, mistreated, or ignored. This is only the beginning." Marcus stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders as they faced the cameras and the crowd. The ordeal had tested their strength, but it had also solidified their commitment to each other and to the cause they now championed. As they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, they knew that they had made a difference, that their story had become a beacon of hope in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The chapter concludes with a sense of triumph and a renewed determination to challenge the injustices that persist. The fight had not been easy, but it had been necessary, and as Abigail and Marcus moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that their courage had helped to bring about real change. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to know more, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. See you in the next stories.